I want to welcome everyone back to the Citizens Grand Jury. We had a brief hiatus, Larry, while we were doing the third Congressional Congress. I think everyone is really interested to see today's session, and I know you share my opinion that although we can't rely on the Department of Justice to do anything, I think it is at least a positive step that Senator Rand Paul has now publicly admonished Dr. Fauci. What are we going to be covering today, Larry?
Well, yeah, I commend Senator Paul for taking this issue on for whatever personal reasons he has in terms of his reelection. I've dealt with Senator Rand Paul before, unfortunately, and this was over the NSA and its illegal mass surveillance during the Obama administration. I filed a class action lawsuit at the time, which ultimately resulted in two legal victories, preliminary injunctions restraining the mass illegal surveillance. Of course, they're still violating it. They don't really care, particularly under Biden and Harris. But this is Rand Paul, vintage Rand Paul, making a point, doing it to raise funds for his reelection campaign, and then grandstanding it, saying he's doing a criminal referral to, you guessed it, the Biden Justice Department. Nothing's going to happen at the Biden Justice Department, as nothing even happened during the Trump years with his two worthless attorney generals, William Barr, and before that, Jeffrey Beauregard Sessions. So I do commend him for taking on Fauci, and we, of course, would always like to be supportive of that. But Rand Paul, after I filed that class action lawsuit, piggybacked on it and then claimed that he filed it first, right? Which was ridiculous. I saw him on the mall later. He's about 5'5", by the way. No aspersions, but I was looking down at him and I said, Senator Paul, I'd like to collaborate with you on this and let's work together. Never heard from him again. So don't pin your hopes on Rand Paul. The bottom line here is that we have citizens' grand juries with regard to the alleged crimes committed by Dr. Anthony Fauci. We've been proceeding. We've had a number of sessions. We do intend to seek his indictment today. We will be sending to the citizens' grand jurors the proposed indictment. You'll look it over. It's quite detailed, by the way, because we've worked on it in the last several weeks. Of course, we had a hiatus because of our third Continental Congress, which will be convening again on July 27th, 2021, just in a week or so. And we're going to hear from some of the delegates we didn't have a chance to hear from, and we're going to deliberate on where the country needs to go from here. We obviously need to take action. But this indictment will be reviewed and sent to the grand jurors today, and we'll go over it next time, and we will be seeking an indictment of Dr. Anthony Fauci. Meanwhile, we're continuing today with the information presented to the citizens' grand jury. And as you know, in 1992, for those who question the legitimacy of citizens' grand juries, the late Justice Antonin Scalia wrote an opinion in United States versus Williams, majority opinion for the Supreme Court, where he found that the grand jury belongs to the American people, not the three branches of government. And consequently, we have the right to conduct grand juries. And we have a right also not to just be bound, although we do cite a federal law and common law in these indictments. We have a right to follow the laws of nature and nature's God, as it says in our Declaration of Independence, wherein our founders wrote, primarily Jefferson, when in the course of human events, the sovereign no longer represents the people, the rulers that is, then the people have a right under the laws of nature and nature's God to alter or abolish that government and to form a new government by and for the people in pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness with equal rights for everyone. That's a paraphrase. So the founders, seeing how unjust the laws of King George III were, went back to Judeo-Christian principles, the Ten Commandments, nature's law, and nature's God. And that's why in this indictment of Fauci, which we're presenting today, we are indicting him not just for lying to the government before Congress, as Senator Paul has rightly accused him of doing, but also lying to the American people. Because under the federal statute, 18 U.S.C. 1001, you get 10 years for every material lie or omission that you make to the government. That's what Roger Stone was convicted of, by the way, with 5 counts of false information to the government, as well as witness tampering and obstruction of justice. That applies to anyone who makes a false statement to the government. But if the government is making a false statement to the people, there's no such law. But it is a law under the laws of nature and nature's God that government officials should be held to account to the same standards as we are held to account before the government. The American people are superior to their alleged government. And right now, we have no government at all. We know that. To the extent we have a government, it's socialist, it's borderline communist, it's atheist, it's every radical ideology rolled into Biden and Harris and their regime. So we, the American people, must rise up, and we are not bound by federal law like our founding fathers. We can pursue the laws of nature and nature's God. And Fauci, once we obtain the indictment, we're going to be asking for that from the citizens' grand jury, as well as Joe Biden, his son Hunter Biden, and his brother James Biden. They will be tried before a citizens' court with a citizens' prosecutor, with a citizens' petit jury. It will be done fairly. It will be done neutrally. These defendants will be given notice of the charges against them. They'll have an opportunity to defend themselves, to send their lawyers if they wish to defend themselves pro se, meaning themselves. They can do that as well. And we will see convictions. And once the convictions are obtained, and I'm confident that they will be, with regard to the Bidens, just most recently we've learned that Hunter Biden, who should be doing coloring books in prison rather than paintings, okay, is selling them for upwards to $500,000 a pop. Now, we know that that's a means of buying influence with the Biden-Harris regime. And we also know that from the testimony of Tony Bobulinski, who's testified before the citizens' grand jury in an appearance that he made with Tucker Carlson several times, that Joe Biden was to get a 10% cut. Bobulinski was going to be the partner of Hunter Biden, but wisely he backed out and came forward with that information. So this is what's important, is that the people enforce the law, much like Wyatt Earp did in the Old West and U.S. Marshals and others before we had a Justice Department on July 1st, 1870. And nothing precludes us from we, the American people, enforcing the laws ourselves. And nothing precludes us even from citizens' arrests once we get convictions. Even in California, the most left-leaning of all states, left-leaning is, frankly, too mild for California. There's a statute which says that if you know of someone committing a felony or see it, that you can conduct a citizen's arrest and then turn that individual or entity over to law enforcement. Well, we don't intend to do anything physical. We don't intend to take anyone into custody and enforce that sentence ourselves. But we will be asking sheriffs throughout the country, police, who are on our side because they've had it with the Biden-Harris administration. And as we know, it was the Capitol Police that actually let the peaceful protesters into the Capitol on January 6th. They were certainly supportive, for the most part, of what was going on, given a few bad people on either side. But I'm convinced that there will be sheriffs and police that will step forward and will arrest Fauci and will arrest Biden and Harris and others. And it'll be done under the color of state law authority and perhaps even federal authority. So we don't intend ourselves to do it. We are going to do it by asking law enforcement to carry it out. And I believe they've had it. Just about a month and a half ago, it's just one example, ex-retired generals and admirals sent a letter to Biden telling him to shape up or ship out, that they're not going to sit by and watch this country being destroyed and turned into a communist gulag. I don't advocate coup d'etat. I don't advocate using force, but that was a warning to Biden to sober up, to take maybe more steroids so he could be more lucid, and not to pursue a course which has destroyed this country in almost 5 months with regard to what he has allowed to happen. So this is where we are. This is our citizens' grand jury. We have a right to do it. And I might add, we're making plans right now to try Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, and James Biden In Tombstone, Arizona, it's symbolic. That's where Wyatt Earp enforced the law many, many years ago. And at the OK Corral, we're not advocating doing what Wyatt Earp did. We're doing it peacefully and legally. But I want it to be symbolic because the American people deserve their legal rights back. They've been stolen from them by corrupt government officials, by a corrupt Justice Department, which is now being used as a Gestapo for Biden and Harris to round up, to arrest, and to indict virtually anyone who was in Washington, D.C., protesting peacefully. Again, there were some bad people, and some people may deserve punishment. But the great majority of those people who were arrested were peaceful. And that's why we filed a class action just a week ago for a Black actor named Siaka Massaquoi, who the FBI busted into his house at 5:30 or 5:45 a.m. in the morning and handcuffed him, handcuffed other people that were there that even had nothing to do with protests in Washington in front of young children. He asked to talk to a lawyer. He was denied that opportunity. He was interrogated. And then they took his computer, his cell phone, and all of the things that he needs to do business and for a livelihood, and won't give it back. So we filed a class action lawsuit. You can see it at freedomwatchusa.org for all the people that were in Washington there peacefully and legally. But the point I'm making is that we have no Justice Department. We have no law enforcement that represents the people anymore in terms of who's under the control of Biden and Harris at the Justice Department. The FBI has been being used in effect as a private Gestapo to quell dissent, as everything else. And I might add another thing. Yesterday, we filed a lawsuit. You can again see it at freedomwatchusa.org against Google YouTube, which limited and suspended us for having a delegate at the Third Continental Congress who pointed out that this vaccine has dangers, that people should think twice before they take it, and was critical of Dr. Fauci. That's Dr. Judy Mikovits. And she's a real hero. Everything that she said has proven to be true, particularly with regard to the lab in Wuhan and how that was used for gain of function and how Fauci played a role in that. And we're going to hear from her again today. But let anybody know, and let the word go out far and wide, that when people do things that harm Freedom Watch and harm the American people and harm your ability to not just get information that you need for the health, welfare, and safety of you and your family and loved ones, but when they subvert the rule of law, that Freedom Watch will represent the American people. And that's why we have these citizens' grand juries. No one else that I know of is doing them. No one else that I know of, frankly, and to toot our horn a little bit, has the guts to do them. Everybody's afraid of this regime, Biden and Harris. Many people would have shown up at our Third Continental Congress, but for the fact that they fear this regime. But you cannot be fearful. Our founding fathers pledged their fortunes and their sacred honor and risked their lives to found a new nation. We will do the same, because we are 90% already dead. We're on our back, gasping for air, almost dead, almost like George Floyd at this point. And there's a lot of similarities to what Anthony Fauci did to George Floyd. As you'll see in the indictment, he engaged in negligent homicide, which resulted in the deaths of millions of people worldwide. And this is something that needs to be addressed and needs to be dealt with. Biden and Harris have furthered this. They're coddling communist China. They refuse to take any action. And other than lip service, nothing is happening. So we must rise up ourselves, we the American people, always peacefully and legally, and assert the same rights that our founding fathers asserted on July 4th, 1776, as embodied in our Constitution. And we must ourselves be the clarion calls to freedom and liberty, because frankly, the government has abandoned us. And notwithstanding, Jason, that Rand Paul wants to, raise money for his reelection campaign and possibly run for Congress for president, and we commend what he said, is that at the end of the day, by referring this to the Biden Justice Department, he knows that that's a sham. As Woody Allen would say, a travesty of a mockery of a travesty of a sham of a mockery of a sham, whatever it was. And we need to take our own action, we the American people, and that's what this is about. So I know you have a video of what Rand Paul said to Fauci, the exchange that he had, and I commend that exchange in and of itself, and also the fact that he made a criminal referral to the Justice Department that will throw it in the trash. And we also have the testimony today of John Cullen, who's going to be dealing with issues involving the so-called Delta variant. And Dr. Judy Mikovits is going to be coming on through telephone to testify that, in fact, what John's saying has a lot of merit. So let's take it away.
Before we do that, Larry, I just wanted to ask you briefly, because we're back after a hiatus. I think there are some people who still have questions about what the function and operation of a grand jury is. Can you give us just a quick overview for people who are new viewers that are joining us? And I also want to let new viewers know that they can watch simulcasts of the Citizens Grand Jury videos on the Freedom Watch YouTube channel. We are live simulcasting there right now, and thanks to the 43 individuals who are watching us there, people can also see the show on rumble.com. You know, Larry, there's a lot of people who don't want to submit themselves to the prying eyes of Google. So the fact that we're able to exist on alternative platforms like Rumble is a really great way for people to educate themselves and learn about the possibilities of the Citizens Grand Jury.
That's right. And the grand jury, accepts information. It doesn't have to be evidence, as Justice Scalia wrote in 1992 in United States versus Williams. You can indict even on mere suspicion, but we have more than mere suspicion. We have hard facts here. And once an indictment is issued, the defendants will have an opportunity to defend themselves in court and to prove their innocence. And at that point, it becomes guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a very high threshold. So consequently, you'll see a lot of what we present is information which is in the public domain, but it is enough for an indictment. It doesn't have to be evidence. And that's where the expression "you can indict a ham sandwich" comes from. But we have more than a ham sandwich here, although we have someone who's acted in a very piggish manner with regard to Fauci, because we also have reason to believe he's profiting from the crimes that he committed. Is that the fact is that he's going to have an opportunity to defend himself in front of a citizens tribunal. And this is not a criminal referral, okay, as the title says. You were talking about Rand Paul, Jason, when you did that. This is an actual indictment that we're talking about of Dr. Anthony Fauci. So let's play this exchange with Senator Rand Paul, and let's hope that he decides someday to cooperate with the American people rather than with himself. And let's get this thing rolling. And, then we'll hear from John briefly. We'll put Judy on and we'll let John finish it up because we said we're going to put Dr. Judy Mikovits on it at 11:30.
Absolutely. Here we go.
Dr. Fauci, as you are aware, it is a crime to lie to Congress. Section 1001 of the U.S. Criminal Code creates a felony and a 5-year penalty for lying to Congress. On your last trip to our committee on May 11th, you stated that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And yet, gain-of-function research was done entirely in the Wuhan Institute by Dr. Shi and was funded by the NIH. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the Wuhan virology paper entitled "Discovery of a Rich Gene Pool of Bat SARS-Related Coronaviruses." Please deliver a copy of the journal article to Dr. Fauci. In this paper, Dr. Shi credits the NIH and lists the actual number of the grant that she was given by the NIH. In this paper, she took 2 bat coronavirus genes, spike genes, and combined them with a SARS-related backbone to create new viruses that are not found in nature. These lab-created viruses were then shown to replicate in humans. These experiments combine genetic information from different coronaviruses that infect animals but not humans to create novel artificial viruses able to infect human cells. Viruses that in nature only infect animals were manipulated in the Wuhan lab to gain the function of infecting humans. This research fits the definition of the research that the NIH said was subject to the pause in 2014 to 2017, a pause in funding on gain of function. But the NIH failed to recognize this, defines it away, and it never came under any scrutiny. Dr. Richard E. Bright, a molecular biologist from Rutgers, described this research in Wuhan as the Wuhan lab used NIH funding to construct novel chimeric SARS-related coronaviruses able to infect human cells and laboratory animals. This is high-risk research that creates new potential pandemic pathogens that exist only in the lab, not in nature. This research matches, these are Dr. E. Bright's words, this research matches, indeed epitomizes, the definition of gain-of-function research, done entirely in Wuhan, for which there was supposed to be a federal pause. Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement of May 11th where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
Your microphone.
Senator Paul, I have never lied before the Congress, and I do not retract that statement. This paper that you are referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain of function. Let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans,
right.
You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly. And I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about. Okay, you get
NIH,
one person.
Let's read from the NIH definition of gain of function. This is your definition that you guys wrote. It says that scientific research that increases the transmissibility among mammals is gain of function. They took animal viruses that only occur in animals and they increased their transmissibility to humans. How you can say that is not gain of function?
It is not.
It's a dance, and you're dancing around this because you're trying to obscure responsibility for 4 million people dying around the world from a pandemic.
And let's let Dr. Fauci.
I have to, well, now you're getting into something. If the point that you are making is that the grant that was funded as a sub-award from EcoHealth to Wuhan created SARS-CoV-2, that's where you are getting. Let me finish.
We don't know.
Well,
we don't
wait
know
a minute.
If it did come from the lab, but all the evidence is pointing that it came from the lab, and there will be responsibility for those who funded the lab, including yourself.
I totally
This committee will allow the witness to respond.
I totally resent the lie that you are now propagating, Senator, because if you look at the viruses that were used in the experiments, that were given in the annual reports, that were published in the literature, it is molecularly impossible.
No one's saying those viruses caused it.
It
no
is
one is alleging that
molecularly.
those viruses caused the pandemic. What we're alleging is that gain-of-function research was going on in that lab, and NIH funded it.
That is
you can't
not.
get away from it. It meets your definition, and you are obfuscating the truth.
I'm not obfuscating the truth.
Senator
You are the
Paul's
one.
time is expired, but I will allow the witness to.
Let me just finish. I want everyone to understand that if you look at those viruses, and that's judged by qualified virologists and evolutionary biologists, those viruses are molecularly impossible
No one's
to
saying
result
they are. No
in
one's saying those viruses
SARS-CoV-2.
caused the pandemic.
Senator Paul,
We're saying they are gain-of-function viruses because they were
they're not.
animal viruses that became more transmissible in human, and you funded it.
And
won't
you
admit the truth.
And you implying.
Senator Paul, your time has expired, and I will allow witnesses who come before this committee to respond.
And you are implying that what we did was responsible for the deaths of individual. I totally resent
could
that.
have
And
been.
if anybody
And it could
is
have been.
lying here, Senator, it is you.
Now, Larry, I'm not an attorney, but is it generally considered good advice to ignore facts and evidence and just accuse the prosecutor of lying?
Well, maybe. Okay. I've certainly done it. In this case, he's lying again. But, he knows that he's not going to be held accountable because who controls the Justice Department? Biden and Harris, who are his benefactors, Biden and Harris. So he can lie at will. And this guy, you just look at his demeanor, he's lying. Okay. So, that's where we are at this point in time. And, I do commend Senator Paul for holding his feet to the fire, whatever Paul's motivations are. I think he has good motivations in part, and also he's grandstanding, to raise money. But given the fact that he looks to the Justice Department to do the job that the American people now need to do. And Rand Paul, is a doctor. He went to Duke Medical School, my alma mater, Duke. I'm not a doctor, but he knows what he's talking about. So this is extremely probative, as we say as lawyers. And Paul hit the nail on the head, is that this Dr. Fauci is responsible for the deaths of millions of people. That's the bottom line. And look at what happened to Derek Chauvin, putting his leg on the head of George Floyd. That was negligent homicide, for which he's going to do 22 years potentially. And, if Derek Chauvin can get 22 years, then once we get a conviction, and I'm convinced we will, we'll ask for life imprisonment for Dr. Anthony Fauci. I don't believe in capital punishment. But in any event, this is negligent homicide. So you'll see it in the indictment. Now let's put on Dr. Judy Mikovits right now, and we can just, John, Cullen, interact with her.
She's not yet joined the call, Larry.
Okay, well, John, if you can in 5 minutes just lay out what you're going to present today with regard to the so-called Delta variant.
Sure.
Then we'll bring Judy in, because I know, having talked with her, Dr. Mike, she agrees with your analysis here. She knows what it is.
Yeah. Well, I think Dr. Judy and I have been coming at this same problem from two very different backgrounds, from two very different sets of training and beliefs. And yet I think we've arrived at very similar conclusions. And it was one of the things that Dr. Judy said early last year, actually, that really stuck with me. It was the sort of thing that I just kept coming back to. It was a touchstone. And she said that, if we haven't done this Koch's postulate isolation thing, which is a twice around thing, Jason and I have studied it a little bit now. If we haven't done that a bunch of times with a bunch of people in a bunch of places, we can't be absolutely certain that that particular virus, meaning the SARS-CoV-2 virus, is what is causing this horrific suffering in the hospitals necessarily. And in order to be absolute, there's certain stuff we've got to do that. And so that got my research really focused on, well, if it isn't SARS-CoV-2 that just killed all these people, what might it be? And so for those who are watching this who are not familiar with my background, a little over 30 years ago, I was working at Oracle, and I helped set up a system that is being used today by Johns Hopkins to map the pandemic. That system was, I don't know, Jason, if you can show the presentation in the first slide that we have in the deck. Yeah, so this map you may have seen on the news. And the first thing that got my attention was that there aren't 10 people dead in Beijing, and that there's not 5,000 people dead in all of China. What that means is that there's more people dead in Maryland than China. And we keep calling this the China virus. So as much as I appreciate Rand Paul's tenacity, I'm afraid he may be looking at the wrong laboratory. I'm afraid that Wuhan and everything that's taken place in Wuhan is really there as a distraction. Now, what makes me say that? The fact that there aren't 10 people dead in Beijing is a beginning. Let's go to the next slide, Jason. The mapping system that I helped build it takes on different looks. In other words, you can make it look like what you see on the screen now. You can make it look like what you're going to see on the screen on the next slide. It's a system. It's like PowerPoint or like Photoshop. And then it takes somebody to configure it and to decide how they're going to color code things and how they're going to lay it out. The person who did this work at Johns Hopkins School of Health is a gentleman by the name of Enfeng Dong from China, an exchange student. According to the Johns Hopkins system, there aren't 10 people dead in Shanghai. There's fewer people dead in South Korea than Louisiana. Vietnam has 100 million people. Laos doesn't have 10 dead. Vietnam doesn't have 1,000 dead with 100 million people. And so when I see this data from Johns Hopkins, I say, well, wait a second. If there's so few people dead in Asia and there aren't 5,000 dead in China, why do we keep calling this the China virus? Thailand has the same population as France, meaning 70 million people are in Thailand and there's not 5,000 dead. 70 million people in Thailand and New Jersey has more dead. All right, so this was what triggered my research. So let's go ahead a couple slides, Jason. Let's go past these maps and let's jump to the slide with, Michael Bloomberg is the gentleman behind the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. So when you're looking at the maps, you're looking at a Michael Bloomberg production, so to speak. And while we're on the topic of Michael Bloomberg productions, we might as well talk about Event 201 and CLADEX and all the other simulations that Johns Hopkins, the World Economic Forum, and Bill and Melinda Gates have been funding every year. Year after year, they do these simulations. I've been saying for a while, Wuhan Schmuhan, meaning that's the distraction. SARS-CoV-2 hasn't killed 10 people in Beijing. It hasn't killed 10 people in Shanghai. There's not 1,000 dead in Vietnam. How deadly is it then? So I started to compare New York to Japan. I compared Michigan to Malaysia. I compared Virginia to Vietnam. New York is more dead than Japan with 120 million people. Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur has fewer people dead than Michigan. How is this possible? Dr. Fauci, I believe, wants us looking at Wuhan. He wants us talking about Peter Daszak so that we don't talk about a guy named Jeffrey Taubenberger. So let's go to the next slide. President Biden extended the national emergency. And now on the next slide, what we're hearing about is Delta variant, Lambda variant, Gamma, Delta, Lambda, every different possible variant, right? And it sounds like things are getting worse. Is that the case? All right. So we have to make sure we understand the setting. Why would it be a problem if there was a new Delta variant, a Gamma variant, a Lambda variant? Why would it be a problem? It would be a problem because there's no oral therapeutics for COVID-19. Is that right, Dr. Walensky? Is that right, Dr. Woodcock? There are no oral therapeutics for COVID-19 approved by the FDA as of today. A year and a half in, you do not have any approved oral therapeutics. Is that correct? Yes or no? That is true. Let's go to the next slide. On October 22nd of 2020, the FDA approved intravenous remdesivir. It is the only approved therapeutic treatment for coronavirus in the United States. The only one. It is intravenous only. And if we go to the next slide, please. On November 20th, less than 4 weeks later, the World Health Organization recommended against it. Dr. Woodcock, is that true? Dr. Walensky, is it true that the FDA's only approved therapeutic is not recommended by the World Health Organization? Is that true? Yes or no? What is the status today in the United States? We're looking at, if you zoom out a little bit, Jason, is that daily deaths or cases? That's deaths. There's something called depletion of susceptibles, and it's happened with every single pandemic outbreak. And the question is, have we reached depletion of susceptibles? Are we expecting 3 more peaks Was this the first third?
Hmm.
Was this the first quarter? Was this the first eighth? Are we halfway to the end, Dr. Fauci? Have we seen other pandemics that have lasted longer than 18 months and after 3 peaks went absolutely crazy and got worse? Have we seen that before in history? Yes or no? Let's go to the next slide. Daily new cases. So yes, daily new cases are up. And the more we test, the more cases we're going to find. This is why not having a therapeutic treatment is a problem, is because as you find more cases, what are you giving people? Dr. Woodcock, what is the approved FDA oral therapeutic treatment for the people who test positive? Nothing. Okay, next slide, please. All right, we just watched Senator Rand Paul talk to Dr. Fauci. What many people have not yet seen is Senator Marshall and the questions that he asked Dr. Fauci. Senator Marshall, on the next slide, Jason, is an MD. He's a doctor. He's not just a doctor. He's an obstetrician, which means he knows a thing about babies. He knows a lot about prenatal kids. Okay, he served. This is a serious guy. Okay, he's from Kansas, and we're going to watch him question Dr. Fauci. Now, understand this took place about 45 minutes after Rand Paul questions Fauci. So the Rand Paul thing has already happened. Now, Senator Marshall, who is a physician, is going to square off. And Jason, when he asks, Jason, I'm going to ask you when he goes with Dr. Walensky, we're going to pause and we'll break this down a little bit. So this is Senator Marshall from Kansas.
Stand by just a second. We've got some audio leaking through here. I'm not sure where that was coming. Here we go.
Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question for Dr. Walensky. As a physician, we always want to be able to know and discuss the benefits and risk of anything that we're prescribing, including a vaccine. It's estimated that 40, maybe 50% of children have already had the COVID virus. What are the additional benefits to the vaccine to a child who's already had the virus?
I think it very much depends on what the variant that child might have had, whether they could potentially be infected or reinfected. And, you know, one thing I just want to note with the children is I think we fall into this flawed thinking of saying that only 400 of these 600,000 deaths from COVID-19 have been in children. Children are not supposed to die. And so 400 is a huge amount for
She just acknowledged that 400 children have died in the country. I've been saying this for a year and a half, and she just acknowledged it without being prompted. All right. So she just said 400 children in the United States have died with coronavirus. 2 years ago, pediatric influenza deaths, 199. And the 400 kids that died with coronavirus, that's in the last 18 months. That's since the beginning of the outbreak. That's since January of 2020, all the way through now. That's more than one season. That's a year and a half. So if we had 200 kids die from influenza 2 years ago, is 400 that big a stretch? Now let's see where Dr. Marshall goes with the questions. But it was very interesting that Dr. Walensky acknowledges there's only 400 pediatric deaths in the entire country, and they are talking about vaccinating all the children. So let's continue.
for a respiratory season.
Thank you. Dr. Woodcock, how many children under the age of 18 without a pre-existing condition, a significant health condition, have died from COVID in this country?
I don't have that at my fingertips. I'm sorry.
Dr. Walensky,
Over 400.
without health
That
condition?
I don't
So
know.
I think the answer is probably zero. So I think if you take a deep dive, most of the children that have died had some type of underlying health condition. Dr. Fauci,
Let's
in my
pause there.
hand is
Let's
a
pause.
three-dimensional printing of the COVID spike.
All right. So what we know from the CDC's mortality data is that more than 50% of the children that died also had influenza as a comorbidity on the death certificate. So if they had influenza and they had coronavirus, that's what Senator Marshall's getting at. Did this just kill kids, or were these kids that also had cystic fibrosis? And that's a deadly combo for sure. And they couldn't answer the question. We have that data. We have that evidence, even though Dr. Woodcock doesn't seem to. Let's continue with Senator Marshall's questioning, please.
Something that's certainly a scientific, just baffles me in so many ways. That it's composed of 2 units, as you know. There's an S2 subunit and an S1, and I'd like you to talk about the S2 subunit for a second. Can you explain the significance of the furin cleavage site, the double arginine CGG codon, if you would, and how that works clinically for us?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Senator. The
You wanna
furin
hit pause?
cleavage site is a site.
Pause. All right. What Senator Marshall just did here was he just let Dr. Fauci know that he knows that this was engineered, because the CGG codon is something that was covered in testimony in the Congress last week. So Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise had a bunch of scientists in testimony last week in the Congress. And what they said was the CGG thing, everybody knows about that. That's on Ebola. It's on Zika virus. It's on HIV. They don't see it on any other coronaviruses. And they said, yeah, we all use that, the CGG. It makes things that much more easy to attach to humans. So this was in other testimony last week. And by Senator Marshall, Dr. Marshall, asking that question to Fauci, he has just basically put Fauci on notice that I know these S1 spikes are built. I see that. And now we're going to watch Fauci dance around the question. So I don't know, maybe you want to roll back 10 seconds or something, Jason, but it's a very specific, very technical question about a very specific aspect of the S1 spike that was covered in testimony last week. So basically, this is a little bit of a trap for Fauci.
It's composed of 2 units, as you know. There's an S2 subunit and an S1, and I'd like you to talk about the S2 subunit for a second. Can you explain the significance of the furin cleavage site, the double arginine CGG codon, if you would, and how that works clinically for us?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Senator. The furin cleavage site is a site of a set of amino acids, which is at the point where the enzyme furin can cleave it so that the virus can then bind to the receptor cell and then enter the cell. So it is seen on a number of viruses. It's been seen it's on the SARS-CoV-2, and it's also seen on other beta coronaviruses. You asked also about the double CGG codon.
Right.
That is a codon, again, that is unusual, but it is also seen on a number of beta coronaviruses. It is not a very common codon for the amino acid in question, but it is seen in coronaviruses.
Dr. David Baltimore, a Nobel laureate, I'll quote him here. When I first saw the furin cleavage site in the viral sequence with its arginine codons, I said to my wife, it was the smoking gun for the origin of the virus. These features make a powerful challenge to the idea of a natural origin for SARS-2. And again, this is Nobel laureate Dr. David Baltimore saying this.
Right.
Would you agree or disagree with Dr. Baltimore?
Well, Dr. Baltimore, who is an extraordinarily accomplished scientist, has backtracked on that statement and says, I wish I had not used the word smoking gun, when it was pointed out to him that actually this is seen in a number of coronaviruses, including one of the common cold coronaviruses. So I believe if you would ask...
So you disagree with him?
Well, I agree with his second statement where he backtracked and said he wished he had not used...
So you disagree with his first statement, though?
And he disagrees with his first statement.
Okay, he's not going to answer the question. We also have the S1 subunit, and I refer to the timeline behind me here. that there was a moratorium placed for viral gain of function in 2014. And I think you'll agree with me that the NIH funded research that led to this, an S1 spike that looks very similar, if not exactly, to what's on the COVID-19 spike.
What are you referring to, Senator? Can you please be more specific?
Yeah. So I'm talking about the S1 subunit of the current COVID-19 spike.
Yeah, what about it? I mean, are you talking about an experiment? Are you talking about a paper that was published?
So I'm talking about viral research that was done using NIH funding with the North Carolina lab, and Dr. Shi developed this S1 subunit spike that looks exactly like what we have on the current COVID-19 spike.
Yeah.
Is that not true?
No, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. Are you referring to the paper of Barrick and Shi in Nature Immunology? Is that what you're referring? I need to know specifically.
Yeah, so Dr. Barrick and Shi printed studies on this S1 unit that was basically the development of the key to the door that was specifically took the original SARS virus and made it so it would bond to the human lung cells.
No, there was no gain. If you're referring, Senator, to gain of function, by the definition.
Okay, that's not my question.
Well,
but would you agree that the spike that was developed there is what's also on the current COVID-19 virus?
That's irrelevant to anything until you have a context in which you're putting it. You're talking about an S1 and a spike in what context? If you're talking about a paper that was written by them?
But you agree or disagree that it's the same spike?
I'm not sure what you're talking about, Senator. I'm really not sure what you're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Senator Casey.
Thank you, Chair Murray, and I want to thank the panel
We're done. You can wrap up.
Let's pause here, because I just want to clarify something, John. You're not saying that COVID-19 has not played any role. What you're saying is that there are other things potentially out there that have played an even more major role.
Absolutely. I think so the SARS-CoV-2 virus is absolutely real. It absolutely is infectious. And if you're susceptible to it, you don't want to get it. It will make you really, really sick. Right. And it hasn't killed 10 people in Beijing.
Well, that's the point that I want to clarify there, because we're relying on Chinese data for that. Only they know.
Well, then I don't want to waste time then. So forget China. Let's go to Nigeria. Nigeria has over 200 million people. There's not 2,500 dead.
No, I understand your point, and it's well taken. But what I want to zero in on, and Jason, see if Dr. Mikovits is available after the conclusion of John's testimony. If not, we can bring her back right now, because I'd like to have her as well. Is the thesis is this COVID-19 Delta variant? Mm-hmm. It dawned on me that it could very well be what you've been talking about. It could be the Spanish flu or some other form of influenza, and not COVID at all that's coming back. Right. And that's what I asked Dr. Judy Mikovits this morning, and she agrees with that, which would, confirm your theory as well, that there's something else out there that Dr. Fauci has not disclosed to the American people that he knows exists. And that's a point too, is that whether or not it's COVID-19 that has caused the majority of the deaths, the fact is material information has been withheld, which constitutes lying to the American people as well as to Congress by Dr. Fauci. Is that there's some reason why we're continuing to experience either COVID-19, Spanish flu, or some other type of influenza. And American people are continually lied to. And as we set forth in our proposed indictment, is that we have reason to believe that Fauci's profiting from this, either through kickbacks from Big Pharma with regard to the vaccines on COVID-19, or his patents that he holds, or some other means that causes him to not tell the truth to the American people. And that's a crime in and of itself. And also, having advocated on behalf of the Communist Chinese regime, he should have registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So he's committed crimes there as well. If it's good enough for General Michael Flynn, it's good enough to hold him accountable as well for that. And then he's obstructed justice with regard to any investigation which is going on with regard to the World Health Organization or the extent there isn't even one by the United States, which is extremely doubtful.
Well, I don't have a theory as much as I have the data to illustrate the cover up. It's not a theory, it's numbers. And when you see two waves and one wave covers the other wave, you wonder, well, wait a second, was that on purpose? And so that's where this conversation goes, was the release of SARS-CoV-2 intentional in order to cover up the H1N1 outbreak? Because the symptoms are almost identical. And so we could blame it on China. We could blame it on Wuhan. We could blame it on Peter Daszak, who's not even a United States citizen. Doesn't work for the NIH. Peter Daszak's an independent, like Christopher Steele. Blame it on some other guy.
And you can blame it on both.
Okay? Right. So you put all the attention right now is on Wuhan, SARS-CoV-2, and Peter Daszak. And what I'm here to explain to the grand jury is that is the distraction from the deadliest virus on Earth. The deadliest virus on Earth is resurrected, reconstructed pandemic influenza from 1918. That's a BSL-4 pathogen, like Ebola, like Lassa virus, like Marburg virus. I mean, this is the stuff Dr. Judy spent her whole life working with in the balloon suits.
Right, I've got it, and I think that you're definitely onto something, John. This is why you're on frequently.
Right.
And
so let Jason.
And you also testify. But let me just add this though: is that the evidence presents, and we've got experts in this regard, not just Judy Mikovits, but Dr. Boyle, and I'll be presenting his affidavit next week as well, before the indictment's actually requested from the citizens' grand jury, is that there's more than a reasonable doubt that the Wuhan laboratory was doing gain-of-function research. There's more than a reasonable doubt this did not come from a wet market, 100 yards from the lab. And we know that lab, Wuhan, is a military lab. And we know that China does research on bioweapons. We know that the United States does at Fort Detrick, Maryland. By the way, both of which is illegal under international law, but that doesn't stop governments from doing it. And so consequently, in terms of indicting Dr. Fauci, you can indict him on both things, okay, with regard to COVID, and you can indict him with regard to an undisclosed pandemic, which has not been put forth to the American people, which is a significant risk. And my thinking was, and I wanted to get you to weigh in on that, as well as Dr. Judy Mikovits, is that this Delta variant may very well be what you're talking about, the Spanish flu, or it may be something else that's out there, a variant of influenza, which is more deadly than COVID-19. And the government, if you want to use the term loosely, government, because I don't think we have a government by and for the people anymore, but they admit that this, or at least they state, that this Delta variant is at least 300 times more infectious and more deadly than what we know is out there.
No. They haven't said it's more deadly. They said it's more infectious. They can't say it's more deadly because more people aren't dying. They can't say that. They've said it's more infectious.
Yeah, we don't know that yet. We also know that they continue to push the vaccines at the same time that they're saying that the vaccines don't work on the Delta variant. Okay, so therefore now we have to wear masks again, right? So people who are vaccinated are now asking. So you know what it is? One lie gives rise to another lie. Okay, and then they got to cover it up, but they can't even stay consistent. It reminds me of a friend of mine in law school at Emory, Bruce Nagel. He's a very funny guy, and someone would ask him, "How did you do on your torts exam?" And he said, "Have I talked to you yet? I want to stay consistent." Right. So, this is what we're dealing with here, is that they have to keep papering it over with one lie after another. And Fauci sits at the top of the pyramid of the most pronounced liar, perhaps ever to occupy a position of responsibility at the National Institute of Health. So that's where we are. Jason, is Judy available? If not, we'll finish with John.
Unfortunately, Larry, Dr. Mikovits is having a technical problem. She can't join us today.
Did you talk to her on that?
I did.
All right, because we were going to call her.
Yeah, and We can't do that today, unfortunately.
Okay, all right, then we'll bring it back.
I can weave it in, Larry. I can explain
Yeah,
how this
leave it
data
in.
supports her theory.
And we'll bring her in before we present the indictment next week.
Yeah. I'll explain how I think what she's been saying is supported by the data I have here. Jason, if you go to the next slide I had on the deck, I think it supports everything Dr. Judy's been saying. Yeah, next slide. All right, so they were talking about all this technical stuff, the furin cleavage site, and go to the next slide. They were talking about that CGG stuff, and that's right up Dr. Judy's alley. I mean, she would tell you, I can order CGG from a catalog. Okay, so that's what I wanted to get into with her. So maybe next week we'll get her back on, and she'll tell you, oh yeah, well, this is on HIV, this is on Ebola, this is on Zika. And that's why this is in the presentation. I wanted her to get into this with us, but next time we'll get to this. So Jason, let's go to the next slide. And what you're going to see here, next one, next slide. All right, so Dr. Walensky confirms there's 400 children dead. So this is everybody younger than 18 in the United States. And in the town hall yesterday, President Biden said, we are considering mandatory vaccines for all children. Now, I am going to tell you right now, more children drown than have died with COVID. So wouldn't mandating life preservers save more lives than mandating inoculation? 400 children. Keep in mind, 2 years ago, the influenza season, 200 kids died in a 12-month period. Let's go to the next slide. If I had been questioning Dr. Walensky, I would have said, Dr. Walensky, the CDC's data shows that in the past 16 weeks, more people have died in the USA from influenza than from COVID. So if more people are dying from influenza, why isn't that a bigger health emergency? That would be my question. If more people are dying from a different virus, how is that virus not the bigger problem? Because for 16 weeks, Dr. Walensky, which is just about 4 months now, more people in the United States are dying from influenza than from COVID, but nobody seems to be looking. Let's go to the next slide, Jason. Let's show everybody what it looks like when you actually look at the data. I hear everybody talking the words data. I don't see anybody actually looking at the data. Dr. Walensky, for the past 16 weeks, more people have died from influenza, PNI, than from COVID, according to your system. This is your data, Dr. Walensky. This is from the CDC. All that blue stuff, that's influenza. That's weeks where more people died from influenza than from coronavirus. The last 16 weeks in the United States. Now, why is that so relevant? Let's go to the next slide and we'll see why that becomes super, super relevant. The CDC and the FDA and the NIH published this thing called influenza burden, which is a way to spin influenza deaths in a very complicated manner. It incorporates how many people died, but it's part of a formula. And so when the CDC tells you on the next page, Jason, on the next slide, when the CDC tells you 22,000 people died last season from influenza, that's using that complicated, crazy formula with the pyramid. What Dr. Fauci doesn't want you to know is what's on the next slide. All right, so 22,000 is that complex thing. In that year, by the way, that says 22,000, the number that's in the CDC's list of death certificates, the number is 274,000, not 22. And they invented influenza burden, by the way, 10 years ago. And that's also something Dr. Judy knows a lot more about than I do. So this is the story that they don't want told. This is why Dr. Fauci, hold on, Jason, hold on at the top, hold the title. Yeah. So this is the story Dr. Fauci doesn't want you to hear. This is why he prefers to talk about Wuhan, Dr. Shi, and Peter Daszak. It's because back in 2005, a woman by the name of Anne Reed, working with Dr. Jeffrey Taubenberger, reconstructed the 1918 Spanish flu working for Dr. Fauci. Dr. Fauci funded it. And for the past 15 years, they've been doing gain of function on H1N1 on and off. Because sometimes there's a moratorium, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Okay, so when there is a moratorium, they stop. But then they go again. But for 15 years, the deadliest virus on Earth has been part of, next slide, the place where Dr. Judy used to work, which is US AMRID. All right, so the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases is where Dr. Judy went to work every day. And this is what they've been working on for 15 years. Now, in the University of Wisconsin, there's another guy who's got another agenda, a little bit different from Taubenberger, because it's all about a pile of money. This is Dr. Yoshihiro Kawaoka. He's also got the 1918 Spanish flu. He's doing gain of function, and he came up with a version that you can't recover from. So this is why Dr. Fauci prefers to talk about Wuhan and Peter Daszak. He doesn't want you to know about this stuff. Let's go to the next slide. There's story after story after story about this work that was written years ago. In fact, if you go to the next slide, Jason, this wasn't my theory. This isn't my warning. We were warned 15 years ago by one of the senior fellows at Google, Ray Kurzweil, the inventor of the Braille machine, the reading machine, the inventor of the scanner. Ray Kurzweil tried to warn us 15 years ago, and we didn't listen. And we let Dr. Fauci do it. We let him spend the money. We let him resurrect the virus. And so then what happens? Well, Dr. Fauci predicts a surprise outbreak. In January of 2017, 1 week before President Trump was sworn into office, Dr. Fauci predicts a surprise outbreak. Has he predicted any other pandemics in his illustrious career? 34 years, 36 years. How many pandemics has he been able to predict in the past successfully? He said this administration is going to have a surprise outbreak. I don't know if I can play that audio clip, Jason. Am I allowed to play that audio clip or no?
We got him right here.
There you go.
Message that I want to leave with you today, based on my experience, and you'll see that in a moment, is that there is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases, both chronic infectious diseases in the sense of already ongoing disease, and we have certainly a large burden of that, but also there will be a surprise outbreak. And I hope by the end of my relatively short presentation, you will understand why history, the history of the last 32 years that I've been the director of NIAID, will tell the next administration that there's no doubt in anyone's mind that they will be faced with the challenges that their predecessors were faced with.
Surprised it wasn't
Is that
33.
foreknowledge? Yeah, I don't know if that's foreknowledge or not, but if you jump ahead 1 or 2 slides, we'll wrap this up. The point here is that when we look at the comorbidities, there you go. Go back to that comorbidity slide, back one slide. When we look at the comorbidities, the CDC itself tells us that only 5% of the 600,000 people died with just SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 on the death certificate. 95% had 4 comorbidities. And the number one comorbidity right there in front of us is influenza. It says it right there on the table. It's the first one. Influenza pneumonia is 276,000 people. They're hiding an influenza outbreak behind the coronavirus outbreak because the strain of influenza points right back to Fauci. And there is no Peter Daszak in the middle. It's Fauci, Taubenberger, and Reed. Let's go to the next slide. We wrap it up with a couple pictures and then we're done. This is multiple years of just influenza. This has no coronavirus, this chart you're looking at. So this is going back to October of 2016. And you see the deaths coming up, and then it's like, whoa, what happened in January 2020? February? It's like, this is unprecedented. We've never seen this many influenza deaths. It has never happened before. So then you go to the next slide, and I did a video a while back saying, could you hide one pandemic behind another? And then we go to the next slide, and when you look at the data, you see, whoa, is this why we were overcounting coronavirus deaths? Why motorcycle accidents and gunshot wounds and people with diabetes and everybody and anybody supposedly died with coronavirus? Is this why Dr. Birx said we take a very liberal approach to mortality? Were we trying to hide an influenza pandemic behind the coronavirus pandemic and blame it on China and blame it on Wuhan? Because if I look across Asia, there's not that many Asian people dead. Japan, Korea, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Burma, Mongolia. There's just not that many people dead in Asia of SARS-CoV-2. And then when we go look at what the World Health Organization just basically stopped reporting on it altogether. They said, no, influenza's gone. How did that happen? So I think that the evidence would indicate that, jump down, Jason, to slide number 67, if you can. Jump down to slide 67. So we know the number, keep going. We know the number one comorbidity is influenza. We know that this influenza outbreak came on, and in January, February, March of 2020, we had over 4,000 people a week dying. Okay, so now what you're looking at, this chart is just influenza. So this is influenza P&I, so pneumonia and influenza together, coming into April of 2020. And so the question is, yikes, what happened there? And then what happened? Did influenza just disappear? Or did something else happen? Well, let's go to the next slide. The next slide are the COVID deaths. Now, these are all deaths, not cases, deaths. The COVID deaths come on in April like a house on fire. And these are your COVID deaths in the United States. Now, wait a second. Those two charts look kind of like a key. Let's go to the next slide. Doesn't the one on the left looks like it might match up with the one on the right? What if we put the two together? What if I did a little copy paste? Look at that. So if I copy paste them, it almost looks like it's one big outbreak, right? Except it started out as influenza and then it became COVID. I think there's laws against this stuff. And the reason there's laws against this stuff is because there's a treatment for that influenza. There are therapeutics for influenza. And by not letting people know what was happening and letting them die, if that isn't negligent homicide, I'm very confused. These people died with influenza, according to the CDC, 274,000 last season, over 312,000 this season. Influenza, not SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV-2 deaths number, when we look at the death certificates that just have SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 on them, it's about 30,000 according to the CDC. That's it, 30,000.
It's amazing research that you've done, John. And I mean, I don't see how people can argue these are the numbers that are being used to drive public policy. So if we disagree with them and think that they're
Scroll up to slide 66. Look at the pediatric deaths, right? Slide 66 is the pediatric. It's only 3-4 slides up. And there you go. This is pediatric influenza. for the last 4 seasons. And this season, it's 1. It was 199, 189, and then 1. That's realistic? No. Charles Ortel would audit this and in 1 second would say, well, that's not right. How could it be 1?
Yeah.
All right. So what you're seeing here is obfuscation. There's 401 children. Go up one slide. 401 children that have died with coronavirus. And nobody's died from influenza, just 1 kid? Okay. I see. Go up one slide. Go up one slide. And there's no influenza after how many cases per week in the United States? 20,000, 25,000 cases of influenza per week in 2020, week 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then it just disappeared. That's a remarkable phenomenon. That's why I wrote a white paper to be submitted to the Nobel Committee on Medicine, because I documented the global eradication of influenza in October of 2020.
This is very, very important, John, and you're a very valued individual, much more than Dr. Anthony Fauci, although one should not laugh about that. But perhaps we should make you the czar of what's going on right now, because you, like Jason said, the statistics don't lie. Okay, that's what they are. But at this point, let us adjourn for next week. Jason, just show briefly up on the screen this proposed indictment. We're going to send it to the grand jurors. We're going to conclude this with Dr. Mikovits next week. The testimony, perhaps we'll bring in Dr. Francis Boyle through an affidavit that he prepared that we've used in our cases in Dallas, Texas, and Jerusalem, Israel, and before The Hague, which is a criminal case that we had filed with regard to what's going on with regard to the Communist Chinese. But I just want to reemphasize is that, 2 scenarios obviously are at play here. The question is which one is causing most of the harm and most of the deaths, and John has pretty much laid that out definitively. But it does not exonerate what went on at the Wuhan lab or with regard to Fauci's lying about China and his involvement with gain-of-function research in China. So we'll adjourn it right now. Just throw up so people can see the proposed indictment, Jason, that we're going to send out, and we'll have this posted on the internet as well throughout the week that people can comment on it, because our citizens' grand juries are not only being seen by our grand jurors, but they're also available for people to watch at freedomwatchusa.org and crowdsourcethetruth.com, and also another platform that Jason has set up as a backstop to what's going on right now. And again, I add that, we're fighting the big tech. We had a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Justice Thomas said it was meritorious. The rest of them up there chickened out, for lack of a better word, the other 8 justices in taking it up. But we just filed a new lawsuit, which is the mirror of President Trump's lawsuit in the Southern District of Florida with regard to Google YouTube. So they would not be well advised to play any more games with Freedom Watch, crowdsourcethetruth.com, or John Cullen or anybody else at this point, because they're walking on thin ice. So I hope people will have an opportunity to see what went on. If they withhold this evidence from the American people, then they are directly responsible for killing people as well, and we will hold them accountable in front of the citizens' grand jury, not just the corporations, but the heads of these corporations themselves.
Larry, I want to also remind our viewers that they can still watch the proceedings of the Third Continental Congress. They're available on freedomwatchusa.org. And I also want to remind our viewers that we can't do this kind of work without your support and sponsorship. So I hope that people will visit Freedom Watch at freedomwatchusa.org, make a tax-deductible financial contribution, and help Larry and his team at Freedom Watch keep this type of work going. People can watch simulcasts of the Citizens Grand Jury proceedings on Freedom Watch TV, which is the YouTube channel available on YouTube at Freedom Watch. And I want to remind people that they can learn more about John Cullen by subscribing to the John E. Hoover YouTube channel. We've had a simulcast of today's video there as well. You can follow John's work. He's been at it for years at this point, and get into detail with what John has been doing there. I want to thank everyone for joining us, both viewers and grand jurors. And I want to remind everyone that you can sponsor and support Crowdsource the Truth by going to subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you for another session of the Citizens Grand Jury next week. Sorry, Larry, please continue.
On July 27th, tune in. Go to freedomwatchusa.org to get more information to see the continuation of our Third Continental Congress.
Absolutely. People will be looking for that. And I want to thank everybody for joining us